Sir Hermann Black Lecture of the Year in Review. Now, who was Sir Hermann Black? Well, Sir Hermann Black was the Chancellor of Sydney University for many, many years. He was a member of RUSI, New South Wales. He was a teacher, an economist, a lecturer, a public affairs commentator. He was an advisor to governments. And he used to come here at the end of each year and give a presentation in RUSI, New South Wales, giving us the year in review, how he saw the various activities that are impacting on defence and security in the last 12 months. We have maintained that historical connection to the Sir Hermann Black Lecture, the Year in Review, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Andrew Greene, the ABC Defence Correspondent, who has been the Defence Correspondent since 2015. He's reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, the United States and Europe, as well as assignments across Australia. And he's participated in 2 international emerging leadership dialogues and was awarded the Elizabeth O'Neill Journalism Award by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 1918. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the microphone Andrew Greene from the ABC. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the honour of being able to address you today for the annual Sir Hermann Black Lecture. I'm perhaps of a different generation to most of you, but I'm going to be very old-fashioned and speak without slides today, because that's how I'm used to doing things. And true to the spirit of this lecture, I would like to offer some of my insights that I've gleaned in Federal Parliament and in the Press Gallery at the Department of Defence about where some things may be headed next year with Australia's national security and defence policies. By way of brief introduction, as Paul mentioned, I'm the ABC's Defence Correspondent, have been since 2015, but for the best part of 15 years I've covered politics from the Press Gallery. Thank you also to Ken Broadhead and to Dr. David Rhys, who I understand can't be here today, who have helped facilitate today's presentation. We're meeting today at the end of yet another tumultuous, intriguing and dynamic year for Australia in terms of global strategic and military developments. Gone are the recent years of high operational tempo in the Middle East, but they have been replaced by the growing challenges in recent years of the continuing uncertainty over the future direction of the US-Australia alliance, the rapid rise of the People's Republic of China, something you've heard about on several recent presentations that I can see, and also the steady, gradual erosion of public trust in traditional institutions such as Parliament and the Fourth Estate, of which I'm a member. Today, with your indulgence, I'd like to cover a fair bit of ground on these topics and offer some insights into what may occur in 2020 and even perhaps beyond. Like our previous speakers, I will closely examine the activities of the Chinese Communist Party here in Australia with their various activities of political interference, but also across Australia's region and some of the responses that may emerge to it. Secondly, I will offer some brief reflections on the still unfolding situation in Hong Kong. It's something that I had the privilege of experiencing firsthand on a recent reporting assignment, but I also believe it's something that will have great implications for Australia and perhaps other Western democracies. Thirdly, while China remains Australia's largest economic power, our most important trading partner, the United States is still very much this country's strongest ally. So I will spend some time examining the uncertainty over the future direction of the American alliance under the presidency of Donald Trump. And finally, 2019, we can't miss one of the other significant events of 2019, and that was the federal election, of which I managed to have some close observations of while spending a little bit of time on Prime Minister Scott Morrison's campaign bus. As usual, there was very little debate about defence or national security in this federal election, but there are some emerging things that we should look at in terms of defence policy into next year and the years ahead. Perhaps there will be a little bit too little detail for many in this very well-informed audience, so I'd be happy to spend some time at the end of these remarks taking questions from you. But if I can begin first with the question of Chinese interference in Australia, the grey zone tactics that we're starting to see emerge, and also the threats in the Pacific. For all its failings over the last couple of decades, the Australian Parliament can at least claim the distinction, dubious or not, to being among the world's powerhouses for the production of new national security laws. We've got preventative detention, travel bans, metadata, secrecy over court cases. All of these have slid seamlessly off the Legislative Assembly line and delivered to the spies and to the law enforcement agencies who've asked for them. So it's no wonder that recently one of the influential politicians in Canberra, who will remain nameless but did help champion these powers and helped manoeuvre them through Parliament, admitted to me that there was some tetchiness, that there was nothing much to show for these new powers. And he said to me, "We want a scalp." And that is something that we're going to hear a lot about over the next few months. Even allowing for the fact that the work of intelligence and counter-terrorism agencies is necessarily done in secrecy, recent events have suggested to me and my colleagues that Canberra's national security community is now well aware of the anxiety to deliver results and is hankering for these scalps to be delivered. Revelations last month that the Chinese Communist Party may have plotted to install an agent in Australia's Parliament have starkly brought into focus the highly charged atmosphere and pressure that's now facing this country's intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Since 2017, we've seen the Home Affairs Department bring together the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, and the Australian Border Force, all with the aim of better coordinating national security work. And across this supercharged mega department, there is a renewed sense, I believe, of muscularity among its various agencies for going after the would-be foreign meddlers that are targeting Australia's sovereignty. Duncan Lewis, the recently retired ASIO Director General, gave an early glimpse of this newfound resolve when he revealed that the domestic spy agency publicly was battling unprecedented levels of foreign interference. That's a warning that he made more than a year ago and has been repeated on several occasions in public forums. His successor, Mike Burgess, another distinguished member of the intelligence community and the previous head of the Australian Signals Directorate, is tipped to be even more forward-leaning in his public pronouncements, and he is going to be quite candid, I believe, in his role as the Spy Chief of Australia. Already, the ASIO boss, who incidentally is the first Director General of Australia to boast his own Twitter account, has taken the historic step of issuing a press release, something I would never have imagined ASIO would do. And that was, very recently, to confirm that the organisation was, quote, taking seriously the latest allegations of Beijing's nefarious activities in Australia. Another figure we'll hear more about, I'm sure, is the new Federal Police Commissioner, Rhys. He's widely expected to revamp the expertise in his organisation to allow officers to better replicate some of that counter-espionage work of their US colleagues in the FBI. Senior AFP figures who I've spoken to say it's unfair to blame their organisation for the lack of scalps so far, because they point to a drastic lack of funding in recent years, reductions in staff, and that age-old problem of lack of information sharing between the various agencies in Canberra. A person who has emerged in recent years who has great insights into this question of foreign interference is a young gentleman by the name of Alex Josky at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a fluent Mandarin speaker, and he has remarked recently that he believes the next thing we're going to be looking at are prosecutions in Australia. Foreign interference, to quote Alex Josky, laws have been introduced. We have a transparency scheme for people who are acting on behalf of foreign governments to register, but to date there haven't been any prosecutions of people carrying out foreign interference in Australia. Yet every day we're getting more evidence that it is indeed occurring. When the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was asked recently why authorities had yet to make a single arrest on foreign interference, he pointed to the case of the businessman Huang Zhangmo, who was this year effectively barred from re-entering Australia. Mr Morrison claimed that when he spoke to other world leaders, they yearned for the integration that Australia has between its agencies under the new Home Affairs Department, as well as the legal frameworks that have controversially passed federal parliament in recent years. The Prime Minister also stressed that his government was prepared to give security agencies any further powers or resources they needed to do their job. And for those close to Australia's foreign interference frontline, it has now been made abundantly clear that their job does involve delivering scalps. If we look further away from Australian soil, the Chinese Communist Party, and I keep mentioning them, but that is very deliberate because to date the overwhelming majority of evidence for foreign interference in Australia is pointing towards that country. There are others. But away from Australian soil, and to some extent there are other nations such as Russia and Iran that are seen to be posing a threat, are continuing to deploy what is becoming known as grey zone tactics, a form of hybrid warfare against the Western world. Now, as the former intelligence chief and now author Alan Gyngell put it last year, the order that we have known for the past 70 years has ended. It's not being challenged, it's not changing, it's over. And I think that those words are quite starkly pessimistic. While the talk of a rules-based order still does persist in Canberra among the political and military elites, privately it is widely acknowledged that the concept is now largely dead. Many consider that the South China Sea is now a lost cause. Beijing effectively controls the crucial trading waters, and attention is now turning to other areas of concerns. In a very significant speech this year, the Chief of the Defence Force, Angus Campbell, warned that Western democracies, such as Australia, were being exposed to these so-called grey zone tactics, which he believes that authoritarian regimes are expert at carrying out. Now, he highlighted some of these political warfare methods, such as cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, commonly referred to as fake news, which he noted were particularly effective against democracies that promote openness and transparency. He observed that the adversaries who deploy these grey zone operations are, quote, often built on the reality or rhetoric of revolution and look out to the other as enemy. Their conception of war is markedly different, Angus Campbell said. He went on to say that typically these states cluster at the other end of the spectrum, where the people they have to serve the state, as does the law, and all the elements and institutions of society and state can be deployed against the enemy. His speech came just several months after Australia's own national parliament fell victim to this new hybrid form of warfare. And as you would have read in the newspapers, that cyber attack on federal parliament had been blamed on an unnamed, and I'll let you guess, sophisticated foreign state actor. It's not hard to guess who Australia's intelligence agencies blamed. But it was a crippling cyber attack, and it infiltrated almost every parliamentarian's IT systems, and it took Australian cyber authorities a considerable amount of time to detect. But arguably, in the past year, in 2019, China's greatest strategic successes have been in our own backyard, where years of foreign aid cuts and general diplomatic ambivalence has allowed Beijing to fully exploit the vulnerabilities of some of Australia's poorest neighbours. In 2019, President Xi Jinping has managed to steadily pick off several tiny Pacific nations who had, until now, steadfastly continued to diplomatically recognise the island of Taiwan. At the same time, Beijing's controversial Belt and Road program has continued to surge ahead in the Pacific, despite the warnings of debt-trap diplomacy and the often white elephant infrastructure projects that it delivers. While there is some evidence of some pushback towards Belt and Road, the program has also managed to get a foothold in Australia, and that was after the decision by the Victorian Premier to sign up to the program, which did cause quite some consternation in Canberra. Australia's belated response to China's rise in this backyard has been the Pacific Step Up, as the program is becoming known, but the critics are already deriding it as the Pacific Catch-Up. It is, I believe, a worthy pursuit, but one that could be summarised as too little and too late. The federal government's stance on global action to tackle climate change has caused some consternation among our Pacific friends who feel that they have, on various fronts, been neglected for many years. In 2020, I predict that there will be some further announcements on the Pacific Step Up. Defence, as we know, is already progressively replacing the Pacific patrol boats that have been gifted over the years to various nations, and we're replacing them with new Guardian-class boats that are able to do a lot more. I'm starting to detect speculation that we may even dedicate a squadron of C-21J Spartan aircraft who could be tasked with regular surveillance patrols of the Pacific. Now, this is a particularly clever concept and has been kicking around in defence for a while, because pairing the RAAF with Australian delivered maritime vessels is a strategic investment in the Pacific that China simply could not match. Another development to watch in the new year will occur in the Philippines, where an Australian defence company has joined with a United States private equity firm to compete for the lease of a former shipyard which closed a couple of years ago. Now, as members of this audience will know and appreciate, in this region, the strategic area of Subic Bay is very important when we think of the South China Sea. A rival bid has been launched to this Australian venture by a Chinese state-owned consortium, and it remains to see precisely what the Philippines President, Rodrigo Duterte, decides to do. But the alarm bells have already rung in Canberra this year with Cambodia, where China has managed to establish a dual-use military port. Closer to home, there's still some constant speculation that the United States would like to open a new port facility just outside Darwin, which could eventually be dual-purposed, like the Cambodian example from China, to allow American Marines, who are increasing in number each year, to land their equipment in the Northern Territory, but importantly, away from the existing Darwin port, which has been leased to a Chinese state-owned company. That brings me to the question of Hong Kong, which in the past week has marked 6 months of the pro-democracy protests. Many had predicted that these anti-government demonstrations that began in the middle of the year would have eventually evaporated, or worse, be brutally crushed by authorities from mainland China. Instead, perhaps surprisingly, the student-led protests who have their origins in the 2014 umbrella movement have actually gone from strength to strength as the year has gone on. Hong Kong's highly anticipated district council elections, which took place in November, delivered a stunning rebuke to the Beijing-backed administration of Carrie Lam. And it's, in my view, really reinvigorated the protest-weary pro-democracy supporters. Just last week, the protest organisers estimated that a staggering 800,000 residents had turned out for a peaceful march in what was one of the largest rallies in Hong Kong this year. Now, on the day that I arrived in Hong Kong in October, the extradition bill, which had sparked this mess, had been formally withdrawn from the city's legislature. But any hope that Beijing may have harboured by this tactical retreat, that the demonstrators would suddenly go away, was quickly dashed. Instead, to the constant refrain of 5 demands, no less, anti-government activists have continued to take to the streets, often deploying more violent tactics to insist on further democratic reforms in the former British colony. Now, the months of protests have severely hurt the Chinese territory's economy and reputation, and it's actually helped plunge it into recession. But the stunning results of those elections prove that the public will and support remains strong, and the constant smell of tear gas doesn't seem to have put people off. It's very difficult for anyone to predict where the political situation in Hong Kong will go from here. Its status as a special administrative region of China is set to expire in 2047, but the impression that I have is that Beijing is prepared to embark on a long waiting game before exerting further control. So why is this all important? During the 2 weeks there, I heard locals constantly remark that what was happening in their city was of global significance. They pleaded for Australia and other democracies to not forget what was happening, and they warned that the Chinese government, if it was so easily to push Hong Kong around without any international condemnation, others, such as Taiwan, would ultimately be next. There's little doubt that Hong Kong and Taiwan are, for Xi Jinping, considered unfinished business. But it remains to be seen how the now President for life, as he is, will act on these 2 troublesome islands. The question of Taiwan naturally lends itself to the US alliance, and America has a great interest in what is occurring in Taiwan. Back in early 2016, during a conversation with a very senior member of the Australian Defence Force, I was trying to get impressions of what was happening with the white paper, but at that time we were preoccupied with what was happening in the United States Republican Party. You'll remember at the beginning of 2016, Donald Trump was still a novelty, considered a bit of a joke, and an outsider that was more than anything entertainment value. But as I chatted with this senior ADF figure, I asked him what he made of the spectacle. And in hindsight, his reply was quite telling. He said, quote, "It's a sideshow, but I'm starting to get worried about how long it's dragging on. The longer it goes on, the more worried I get." Now, if it wasn't for Donald Trump's spectacular victory, I would have probably forgotten this conversation completely. But once the initial shock of the victory had settled, Australian politicians and ADF leaders set about assuring each other that despite whatever pronouncements were made by the new administration about US allies having to pull their weight or pay their share, Australia's alliance would remain rock solid as it always had. Following every spectacular public spat between the US president and a world leader, or after particularly bizarre White House leaks, diplomatic and defence officials would publicly and privately insist to their friends that military cooperation and alliances were continuing as they always had, despite the political bluster. But despite these assurances from US figures, distrust of the United States among Western allies has steadfastly increased since Donald Trump's ascendancy to the job. While the Anzac alliance, to which Australia has paid a very significant price in both blood and treasure, remains rock solid, other relationships in our region have been rattled. Nations such as Japan, South Korea and the Philippines have all been forced to reassess their long-standing arrangements and certainties, while organisations such as NATO have also been forced to genuinely ponder their future. For the past few years, the Trump presidency, in the first years rather of the Trump presidency, there was a misguided view that the era would soon be over and some form of normality would return to US politics. Slowly, however, the realisation is dawning on governments and commentators and militaries that this is unlikely and that 4 more years of a Trump presidency needs to be prepared for and all the uncertainty and unpredictability that that may bring. As the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd argued in a speech in Canberra just last month, Australia must, quote, continue to consolidate its alliance with the United States. He went on to say, the alliance remains an enormous force multiplier for Australia at every level. It remains a critical factor impacting China's long-term strategic perceptions of Australia. It creates greater respect in Beijing for Australia, not less. And given that China continues to recognise the formidable capabilities of the US Armed Forces and the closeness of the alliance relationship Canberra has with Washington. Personally, I am not pessimistic about the future of the US alliance, but I do believe in reality Australia must prepare for an increasingly challenging future. The renowned defence analyst Alan Dupont has observed in today's Australian newspaper that anyone who doubts that the long-term peace in Asia has come to a precipitate end need only scan the latest news to see the confluence of geopolitical disturbances that has turned our once tranquil region into a comfortable zone of conflict and strategic rivalry. He goes on to cite some examples. Last month, South Korea and Japan scrambled fighters to intercept Russian and Chinese bombers intruding into their air defence identification zones. China rails against the mooted US missile deployments to the region and arms supplies to Taiwan, and makes clear that it will use force if necessary to reunify Taiwan with the mainland. India and Pakistan are at loggerheads over disputed Kashmir. Hong Kong, as I've mentioned, is in turmoil. North Korea has resumed ballistic missile testing, and Beijing is tightening its control of the South China Sea, although I would argue that battle is already lost, by continuing to militarise artificial islands, heaving Vietnam and the Philippines, and establishing what looks suspiciously like a new military base in Cambodia. Tellingly, Alan Dupont warns that East Timor may be next. Which brings me to the final topic I'd like to explore today, and that's the federal election that we've just had, defence policy and the lack of debate of it in that election, and some of the questions for defence industry, which I believe will be a major topic in 2020. Now, in April this year, the Prime Minister fired the starter's gun on a 5-week election campaign, which he was widely tipped to lose. Most political insiders from both sides, the commentators, the journalists like myself, and the hapless pollsters wrongly predicted the coalition would fail to secure a third term under its third leader. As is often the case during Australian elections, though, during this 5-week campaign there was virtually no mention of defence or security policy, with the notable exception of a spectacular intervention by former Prime Minister Paul Keating. In an interview with the ABC after Federal Labor's campaign launch, Mr Keating stridently attacked the heads of Australia's intelligence agencies and declared that the nutters were in charge. According to Mr Keating, these organisations had, quote, lost their strategic bearings, and he urged opposition leader Bill Shorten to clean them out if he won the May election. He took particular aim at a former colleague of mine and the one-time Fairfax Beijing correspondent John Garneau, who, as many of you will know, became an advisor to Malcolm Turnbull and helped to write a classified report for ASIO on Chinese influence in Australia. Paul Keating said of Garneau that once this Garneau guy came back from China and Turnbull gave him the ticket to go and hop into the security agencies, they've all gone, quote, Burko ever since. When you've got the ASIO chief knocking on MPs' doors, you know something's wrong. There's no doubt that Paul Keating wanted to make a lasting impression on this year's election campaign, but it's highly unlikely that his comments produced the result he was after. Instead, the attack on Australia's intelligence agencies drew an instant rebuke from the Prime Minister and prompted the opposition leader to quickly endorse the work of ASIO and others. The attack was met by the comment from Bill Shorten that we've worked well with the national security agencies. They know it, we know it, and of course we'll continue to do it, Bill Shorten said. In my view, Mr Keating's comments and subsequent rebukes also serve the purpose of guaranteeing the survival of one of Canberra's most formidable figures, and I speak of the Secretary of the Home Affairs Department, Mike Bozzolo. Since his time as an advisor to the former Labor leader Kim Beazley, Mike Bozzolo has pushed for the establishment of this mega department, but many current Labor MPs had been agitating for Bill Shorten to remove him from his position if they were to win the election. And apart from Mr Keating's intervention, there was virtually no debate or policy differences between the major parties on national security or defence during the campaign. And that is an important point. While they have their differences on many things, defence and national security so far appears to be a bipartisan affair in Australia, although it is fair to say that on the fringes of politics, perhaps the divide is further on national security. Labor did have one difference with the coalition during the election on defence, and that was to commit to a brief pause on the massive future submarine program if it won office. Labor believed it was something that needed time to be assessed before they proceeded with it. Over the past years, journalists such as myself have reported on the various difficulties and delays that that French-run program is experiencing. But we've been met with furious denials by government and military officials. Finally, last month, we had the first public hint and confirmation, I believe, that the plan to design these new, highly complex, conventionally powered fleet of 12 submarines was not going quite well as we were being led to believe. Appearing before the Senate Estimates Committee, Rear Admiral Gregory Samet acknowledged that the program is now estimated to cost, and I'll pause as I say this, $225 billion over the course of the life of these attack class submarines. Get your head around that figure, $225 billion. Construction on the first boat, we're told, would not begin until a year after we had been expecting, and that's in 2024. Conservatively, I estimate that the program is already running 18 months late, and we have not yet completed the preliminary designs. In the year ahead, expect that defence policy will be a much bigger talking point as local Australian companies grow louder in their dissatisfaction at how many Australian dollars are heading overseas to large primes or large defence companies based in the United States and the UK. Already, the Australian Industry and Defence Network has called for an urgent review of the Australian industry capability, known commonly as AIC program. I believe these concerns will only grow in 2020. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps not since the Battle of Midway have Australians felt genuinely threatened at home by a foreign power. 3 generations of Australians, myself included, have enjoyed the peace and stability brought about by the old rules-based order. What's not certain is whether the 4th generation of Australians will be so lucky. I fear the 5th generation will almost certainly not be so fortunate. I thank you for your time.